tell a story too. I want to tell you the story about my 0th birthday, the day that I was born. On the day that I was born, the doctor who delivered me held my tiny body gently in his hands for just a moment. And then he examined me to make sure I was all right. He cast a quick glance between my legs and then handed me to my mom and said, "It's a boy." I in turn screamed, which today seems like a completely appropriate and in fact reasonable way to respond to such a ridiculous sort of pronouncement, don't you think? Now, it was probably just coincidence that I reacted that way to the doctor's declaration. I was, after all, 0 years old at the time, and I knew very little about such things. But if I had been able to understand what he was saying, and if I had an even tenuous grasp of what his words would mean for me, I probably would have screamed. At the very least, I would have said something like, "Hey, wait a second, can't we talk about this or something?" Because for as long as I can remember, I've known that when that doctor said, "It's a boy," he was wrong. It was a difficult truth for me to accept. I doubted it for a decade. I fought it for another one. But eventually I found the courage to offer a somewhat more articulate response to the pronouncement that the doctor made on my 0th birthday. I found the courage to stand on my own 2 feet and to look the world in the eye and to say, "It is not a boy, actually. It's a girl." It was, if you'll excuse the shameless appropriation of the phrase, a little bit like being born again. Of course, there's a big difference between being born and taking one's place as a whole, healthy, and mature human being. And in between the two, there is a journey, one that's fraught with challenge and danger and risk and the special kind of pain that comes with and catalyzes growth. This is true of any human being beyond their 0th birthday, I think. And it was true of me as I moved beyond my own rebirth. That journey began for me when I spoke my truth. But speaking my truth, saying, "I am woman," meant having to say something else. I am transgender. And by that, I mean that I am one of a very small number of human beings whose innate and inherent sense of who we are as it relates to gender doesn't match up with the sex that we were assigned at birth. And though the condition known as gender dysphoria is well understood, as is its treatment, by the medical and mental health professionals who care for people like us, it's widely misunderstood by practically everybody else. And so as a result, transgender people, or trans people, as we're sometimes known, are routinely mocked, shunned, laughed at, scorned. We're the targets of violence in the streets, discrimination on the job. We're often rejected by families and friends, kicked out of churches and synagogues and schools, renounced by the institutions that had embraced us before we chose to speak and to live our truth. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I set out on this journey to become the person, the woman that I'd always known myself to be, not to become transgender. I mean, who wants to identify with a medical condition, right? Who would willingly embrace a label that brings with it such fear and such loathing? No. I railed against it. I shook my fist at the heavens for it. I wept over it. Because of it, I shook with fear under barrages of slurs and threats hurled at me by strangers on the street. I shuddered in pain under needles and scalpels as my body was remade to affirm the image of myself that was imprinted upon my mind from birth. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Hardest thing I'd ever contemplated doing, and often it's still hard. But somewhere along the journey, something changed. Despite all of the pain and travail, I grew not only to accept my journey, but to treasure it. Today, I am accepted by the world without question as the woman that I am and have indeed always been. And I no longer have to wear a maligned and misunderstood medical condition as my identity. And yet, today, I choose to. Today, I say it with pride. I am transgender. And with no small amount of gratitude either. Because today, I see it as one of the greatest gifts that I have ever received. I'm thankful that I'm transgender because being trans showed me that there were other perspectives, other ways of viewing and experiencing the world that were just as valid as my own, maybe even more so. I got my first peek behind this veil late one night in the first year of my transition from man to woman. I was living in Texas at the time, going to grad school, and I was still presenting as the old male me much of the time. I wasn't that night, though. I'd been out dancing with friends. I was wearing a denim miniskirt that, had it been any shorter, could have legitimately qualified as a belt. I was having an adolescence of sorts, so work with me here. I was wearing heels and a cute top, and as I walked to my car at 2 a.m., I heard a noise in the alley behind me. And though I had never feared for my safety in the dark before, I'd been a football player and a boxer and a soldier, for heaven's sake. That night, teetering like Bambi in shoes that I had just begun learning how to wear, I did. I felt fear. Later, I drove home on the same stretch of interstate that I drove every day to school, and I drove it just like I did when presenting as a man, 20 miles an hour over the speed limit, like I owned the road. But then I imagined what might happen if I were pulled over on that lonely stretch of highway by a Texas state trooper, and what message he might choose to read into the clothes that I was wearing. And I became the safest, most conscientious driver the Lone Star State had ever seen. The next day I called my sister, and I told her what I thought and what I felt. And she laughed knowingly and said, "Allie, I've thought and felt those things almost every day for my entire adult life." What had been epiphany for me was just another day at the office for my sister. What was a way of life for her, and for billions of women, had seemed so unfair to me. Why should I be afraid? And in that moment, I learned that privilege, that unearned advantage that some people get due to the lucky circumstance of their birth, is a real thing. And more importantly, I realized how my own privilege had blinded me to that fact for so long. And I saw that it had made me a part of the problem of social inequality, rather than what I wanted to be, what my values demanded of me, part of the solution. I'm so grateful for that experience, and for so many more like it, because, I mean, they began to accrue over time, until eventually I learned to question my assumptions about, well, everything. Being transgender made me very aware of the impact that the communities to which I belonged had on my ways of thinking and being in the world. It taught me to examine them critically for the very first time. And I learned how easy it is to fall prey to shared prejudices, the lies that we tell ourselves and that we tell each other, and how hard it can be to disentangle ourselves from them. In those early days, even after I was finally able to shed my male identity for good, I often felt like every person that I met was judging me. Whether it was a family member, a friend, a coworker, a casual acquaintance, even the complete strangers walking around me on the street. I imagined that they were all scrutinizing me, my appearance, my dress, the way that I walked, the way that I held my hands. On good days, I imagined that they inferred me to simply be an unattractive, ungainly sort of woman. On the bad days, well, you can imagine. The turning point for me came one day as I was walking down a busy street, and I walked past a woman, and our eyes met, and in my head, I heard the words that I imagined her saying to herself when she looked at me. Oh my God, that's a man. And a few moments later, I passed a man, and I heard what I imagined to be his thoughts too. Look at that freak. And I winced to be judged so harshly. But then I realized the obvious, that I can't read minds, and that I have no way of knowing what other people are thinking, and that therefore those words that I was imagining were not coming from them, they were coming from me. I, a transgender woman, was struggling with anti-transgender prejudice, and the target was myself. You see, social norms hold such sway over us that even those of us who have been hurt by them, oppressed by them, crushed under them, are not immune to their power, even once we're free of them. And so we do things like that to ourselves, and we do them to each other. I once offered a compliment to a transgender sister of mine who had recently undergone plastic surgery to soften the once angular contours of her face. And she thanked me for the compliment, and then she asked me who had done my plastic surgery. And I responded truthfully and said that I hadn't had any. Good genes, I guess. And she leaned in close and put her hand on my arm and whispered conspiratorially, you know, you could be really gorgeous if you had all your work. And she didn't mean any harm, at least I don't think she did. She'd just fallen for the same lies that I had, but maybe you have too. But you know what the truth is? I am really gorgeous. I am gorgeous and sexy and fabulous, and there's nothing wrong with my face, or my figure, or the way that I walk, or the way that I hold my hands. Being trans has helped me to see that and to understand it, and it's given me a better balance, if you will, to measure the value of society's messages about beauty and worth. And it's taught me that the truth is we're all beautiful. We're all worthy of the world's love and admiration, and we're worthy of our own. And that is perhaps the greatest gift that being trans has given me. It's led me to imagine a new, radically different kind of love, and not just to imagine it, but to experience it and to live it out. When I was a child, I learned a brand of belief that used the word unconditional to describe divine love, the epitome of all love. But what that brand of belief really taught me was this, that my wrongs were so egregious and the resulting flaws to my character were so ugly that I was really only lovable in spite of them. No wonder I kept them a secret for so long, from everyone, even from those closest to me. Danielle and I had been married over a decade on the day that I finally spoke my truth and set out on my journey. My greatest fear then, my greatest fear, was that my search for health and for wholeness would cost me my partner's love. Or worse, that she would feel compelled to struggle her whole life to love me in spite of the fact that I'm transgender. I should have known better. Danielle quickly discerned the truth about my experience, and she saw a divine hand in it. And she became my strongest support and the source of my deepest strength as I made my transition, and she remains so today as our marriage enters its 20th year. And last year at Christmas, she took my breath away by giving me an extravagant gift, a string of real pearls, the first ones I'd ever owned. There was no card in the box, just a tag that read, "To Allyson, love Danielle," but the message was so clear. With these pearls, my wife was saying to me, I value you, all of you. I don't love you in spite of who you are, but because of who you are. And so when people hate you for who you are, I will stand up for you. When they attack you, I will defend you. When they deride you, I will sing your praises. And I will make whatever sacrifice is asked of me for you. Not because I'm compelled to, but because I want to. You're worth the sacrifice. You mean that much to me. I'm so glad that I'm transgender. I might never have known this truest, deepest kind of love if I were some other way. Of course, you don't have to be transgender to learn the things that I've learned. It helps, but it's not a necessary precondition to unpacking your privilege, learning to view the world through the eyes of another person, accepting your own beauty and worth, or loving someone for all that they're worth. All you really have to do is believe that such things are possible, and then speak your truth over and above the so-called truths that have been assumed about you or imposed upon you, and set out on your own journey. And I wish you well, and many great discoveries of your own along the way. Thank you.